The night has come, it's cold and losing my control. Your light is gone, and lonely darkness fill my soul. I wish that you could save me from my isolation. It's way too complicated. Let's start this conversation. Let's start this conversation. We got no relation.
Good evening, and if you're just tuning in, you are either listening to or watching live. As I'm trying to plug my phone in, I thought I did that ahead of time, guys. Give me a sec here. Anyways, you were listening live to UFO Paranormal and United Public Radio Network, and this is the Angel Rock. I'm your host, Lorilei Potvin. A little bit about myself. I'm a Canadian psychic medium, crystal Reiki energy healer, Akashic Records practitioner, spiritual teacher and mentor. I'm also an animal communicator and a registered nurse. I'm well-versed in near-death experiences, having had one as a toddler myself and studied them professionally and personally for over 40 years. And I'm extremely well-versed in the paranormal. I always say I didn't go looking for it, it found me. And we've actually shared some of our story from our previously very haunted house on the Travel Channel's Paranormal Survivor. You can find it on YouTube. You can find it all over the place. It's called Demonic Hauntings. And you're going to see it season 4, episode 9, and you're going to see a familiar face that I didn't know at that time. I got to meet her since. It's our own Michelle DeRoche. She was one of the professionals consulting on the episode, and she's also our station manager. She has one show on Tuesdays from 2 to 3:30 called Beyond the Outer Realm, and then the Outer Realm on Wednesday and Thursday evenings live at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I also can't forget to give a huge shout out to one of my very, very good friends and co-hosts, Carrie Lynn Shellhorn. Both her and I do Beneath the Hollow Moon on Thursdays at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You guys, we are still looking for stories. So we are doing the Holiday Haunted Hotline on Christmas night. I was going to say Christmas Eve, 7 p.m. It doesn't have to be a scary story. Maybe you can tell us all about, did you witness a Christmas miracle, something exciting? We'd love to have you come on and join us for 5 minutes at a time. I think we've got a few guests that are coming in, and we'd love to have you join us. So you can share that either on Carrie Lynn's email, which is Carrie Lynn's porch@gmail.com. So it's KERRILYNN and an S after that, porch@gmail.com. So let me go through our quick list here. And my very patient guest, I will then introduce him. Got a good Christmas topic tonight for you guys. And we're going to say hi after I read his biography too. So you guys, if you want to watch us on TV, you can. The network does have its own TV channel. You just go to Roku and you're going to go to the channel store and type in UFO space P as in paranormal. And there's a drop-down list. I believe we're the 3rd or 4th one down, and you're looking for UFO Paranormal and United Public Radio. I'd also like to give a huge thank you to Carnation. They sponsor all the live shows here on Mondays. We call it Carnation Mondays. And we're really appreciative that they do sponsor Mondays for us. So, and I know Carnation is a global brand. So if you're out doing some shopping and you run into something that looks appetizing in its carnation, please consider supporting them, because they support us to bring you all the great shows here. What else do I want to tell you guys? Hang on here. I'm getting organized. This network's been around for 25 plus years. We do broadcast to every country in the world. So, but 80% of our audience is audio only. So if you want to join the conversation, the best way, I say, you have to see us to join the chit chat, because you're going to hear me talking to people that are here and reading some of their questions and comments. Like one of our favorite people here, Gavin Lee Davies, introduced Paul and I together. Thanks, Gav, for being here. I do want to wish you happy holidays, happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas, whatever you may celebrate at this time of year, and thank you for joining us. So you can join us if on Facebook under my name, Lorilei Potvin, also on LinkedIn, and I'm on Instagram under that name, and my YouTube channel is Angel Rock with Lorilei Potvin. And for the network, we are under UFO Paranormal and United Public Radio Network on Facebook, our YouTube channel by the same name, Twitch by the same name, and then I'm using the owner of our networks he's got many more people on Rumble than I do under Jojo Mon. So I want to give a huge shout out to Joe Montaldo, because without him, we wouldn't have these shows. He broadcasts this from his house on the bayou in New Orleans. So we really, really appreciate that he does that. And we do stream several live shows 7 days a week here. When we're not streaming live, the archive server kicks in. So we are streaming 24 hours a day, and the shows just randomly are picked when we're not live over the last 25 plus years. So there's some really interesting content there. Now, we are revamping our website. You can find us on www.uprntalkradio.com. I hear there is supposed to be a chat room, so that's another place people could join in for the chat. And I hear there may be a merch store coming, so stay tuned for that. Now, let me read our wonderful guest's bio here. I got to get to it. His name is Paul Weatherhead. Welcome, Paul. He's a native of Calder Valley and brought up, and I hope I say this right, Paul. You can correct me if I don't. In Hebden Bridge, is that right, or is it Hebden?
Right. Hebden.
Okay. Okay, thank you. After several years teaching in Greece, Moscow, and Northern Siberia, he returned to the valley in the late 1990s. He has a long-standing obsession with the weird history of the area, leading to the first edition of, and this is in quotations, Weird Calderdale in 2003, which went on to become a local bestseller. His research into Alan Godfrey's alien encounter led to a deeper investigation into the phenomenon, which formed the basis of his Master's of Arts dissertation on the philosophy of alien abduction. Paul's writing has been published in various magazines and journals, including Psychology Today, The Skeptic, and Northern Life. He frequently writes on episodes on mass hysteria, delusions, and weird history, everything right up my alley. And tonight we're going to talk about his book that's called Phantoms of Christmas Past, Festive Ghost Hoaxes, Ghost Hunts, and Ghost Panics. Welcome, Paul. I'm so glad to have you here.
Yes, well, I'm pleased to be here, and thank you for the invite.
Oh, it took long enough. You were so patient, so thank you. Because I think we booked this in June. I think that's how far back it was. So
it's quite a while back, but this is a more appropriate time, definitely.
I was so glad when you picked this date because it was perfect for Christmas. Well, before we jump in, let's say hi to everybody here quickly. Let me see. I got to go up here. So we have our own host from our own network, Paranormal Heart Podcast, Kat Ward. She does her show, Paranormal Heart Podcast, Tuesdays here. I think it's at 6 p.m. Correct me, Kat, if I'm wrong. She says, hey. We got Z-Sun Dragon, or Kevin, as I like to call him by his muggle name. He says, hi. Kev, I got to give you a huge shout out. I haven't had a chance to get back to you, but thank you so much. I had on somebody from the UK last week. That's a friend, Azria Beckham, and she did a first level alien DNA analysis of myself and gave me the most beautiful message. And I was going to go back and transcribe it. And Kevin did that for me. So thank you, Kevin. I appreciate that. So let's see. We got Contessa Martins here. Hi, welcome. And let's see. Of course, we got Gavin Lee Davies says, two of my favorite people, and happy holidays to you both. We love you too, Gavin. And then Kat says, I still can't say your last name the English way, Lorilei, only the French way. I never say it the French way. Actually, Potvin in French is Potvin, and it actually, when you translate it, it means jug of wine. So no reason why, but that's how you translate it. So let me check on Instagram here. Instagram's, we've got, sorry, I don't even know how to say your name. I think it's Met Hivitz has just joined in. So welcome. And we're happy to have you join us. So Paul, that is quite a topic for a book. And I was asking you a little bit before the show. So what got you interested in the topic of ghost hoaxes and Christmas stories and everything behind that?
It started really when I was researching a local history book about the area where I live, and there was this strange episode of mass hysteria that happened in Halifax in West Yorkshire in 1938. And in this episode, there were these weird razor blade attacks on mostly on women, but on a group of people who were walking home at night. And then this guy in a raincoat with a razor blade would jump out and slash them and then run away. And it led to this huge hysteria with huge patrols walking around the streets trying to catch the Halifax slasher, as he was called. And then there started to be 3 or 4 attacks every night, and then it spread to other cities. There was a Glasgow slasher and a Birmingham slasher, and all around the country there were these strange slashing attacks. And as the police investigated it, it turned out that all the victims of the Halifax slasher had in fact cut themselves and then invented this story of the slasher.
Are you serious?
Yeah, it's a really strange story. It's people can look up the Halifax slasher, they'll see it, and this kind of episode of hysteria got me interested in that kind of thing. And as I was looking through the newspaper archives, I kept seeing these strange stories about ghosts, except the ghost would always be a man with a white sheet or a tablecloth over his head hanging around in a graveyard trying to scare people. But they led to this same kind of hysteria and mass patrols at night as people tried to catch it. So it was sort of looking into this case of mass hysteria in 1930s Halifax on the one hand, but also just having, like, I guess a lot of your audience will have this sort of long-standing fascination with stories of the weird, the wonderful, the occult, the paranormal, the unexplained, and having a childhood fascination with these and reading about them as a kid. So it was those two things together that sort of brought about my interest in this book.
Well, the reason why our network has two names, because like I said, it's been around 25 plus years. So when Joe started it, and he runs a site called ICAR, I think, .net. It's International Center for Alien Research and what have you. He found that nobody wanted to come on shows when it was called UFO Paranormal. So he also called it United Public Radio Network. So people were more apt to come on without a title, obviously 25 years ago, and even up to, I'm going to say 15 years ago, maybe. I can't say 10, but the paranormal has always kind of been taboo to talk about, except I know it was all the rage in, the 1920s to 1930s. But other than that, right, that's why it has two different names. So I forgot to tell people this. It's not all just UFO and paranormal in the network. Actually, we do have many different types of hosts, and there's always new hosts coming on. But the majority, yes, and they love to talk about the strange, the weird, and the wonderful, and so do I. So have you got a history with the strange and the weird and the unusual?
Yeah, well, apart from my history, really is the fascination with it that got me investigating it from a young age, but really starting when I started working on Weird Calderdale in 2003, and then revamped it in 2020 during the lockdown. So diving into everything deeper. But that sort of led to me working with an American professor called Robert Bartholomew, who's a renowned sociologist, on a work about what you might call mass sociogenic illness, where the book's called Phantom Attackers and Social Panics and Phantom Attackers. It's when communities come to believe that there is an evil attacker hiding in their community, but it turns out that he doesn't exist. A bit like the Halifax slasher is the classic example. So there are many of these sort of that spread throughout history where people become convinced that there's somebody in their community who's carrying out these random attacks. But when in the end, when it turns out that this phantom attacker doesn't exist, and it's either things like people are injuring themselves, or maybe just getting accidentally injured, or we've probably heard, we've all heard cases of often happens in girls' school and in factories where suddenly people start fainting for no apparent reason. But it's these kinds of panics that sweep through populations and infect them that I've sort of really been interested in, and that sort of was like the bridge between my investigation into the Halifax slasher and weird stuff in where I live in West Yorkshire to the wider world of mass panics, and from that into the strange niche world of 19th and early 20th century ghost panics.
Yeah, and you know what, you see that we always got to be careful on YouTube. I'm just saying it for generalities, but I have looked quite deeply into mass hysteria and fear, because fear is a powerful emotion when you're trying, even anybody that creates it knows that it creates a lot of power. And when you're in a place of fear, you really can't think of anything else, right? There's fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And it grows and grows because people start talking, and especially if people are injured. So, and every time you say Halifax, we have a Halifax here in Canada. So I keep thinking Halifax. So how did this guy get caught? Like, how did they find out that he was a hoaxer?
Well, with the Halifax slasher, it wasn't that he was a hoaxer. It was that he didn't exist. It turned out when
You said that. Sorry, you said that. Yes, he wasn't. But how? Okay, so how did they discover that he didn't exist?
One of the victims told the police that he'd wrestled with the Halifax slasher and he'd ripped the sleeve off his raincoat. So the police had a clue. They had this raincoat sleeve. And so the police found the raincoat with the missing sleeve, and they put them together. And the owner of the raincoat was the victim. And so it was then that they started re-interviewing them, and things didn't make sense because this attacker was attacking people, miles apart within minutes of each other. So once it came together and the police started re-interviewing the victims, and they all started to confess that they blamed it on their nerves, or they did it to get back on their boyfriend, or they did it for all kinds of reasons. But yeah, and then the strange thing happened all around the country, that in all the other cities where this slasher had appeared, it just vanished like that, and the victims confessed to having made up the story. So yeah, it's a very strange thing, but I suppose it's one thing it's an uncomfortable fact that there's a significant minority of people who live and work and walk among us that make things up. Sometimes psychiatrists have called it factitious disorder, and they, present to hospitals, and they go through procedures claiming to have symptoms that they don't have, and they sort of harvest people's sympathy. But I think there's something of that going on. But it's a strange and bizarre kind of episode, and there are echoes of it in the ghost panics of the 19th century that we talk about in Phantoms of Christmas Past.
Yeah, I was thinking as you were saying that, I was looking into dissociative identity disorder that used to be called multiple personality disorder, and looking into the research, and depending on this is how powerful our minds are. For people listening, I'm sure with the research you've done, but each different personality, and they've done thousands of studies of people that have DID, if they say might have one personality might be diabetic and needs to take insulin and has like all the issues with diabetes, and then when they switch into the other personality, they don't need the insulin and things like that. Like, that just blows my mind, how powerful the belief that you are actually who you are, and create a medical condition that you don't have, but through the illness, right? So
there's a strange sort of way, that when people are sort of swept up in what we might call a hysteria, they stop believing what they see and they start seeing what they believe. So that's a strange fact about the human condition.
So now I got to ask you, I know it's probably going to be hard to pick, but what was the most strangest story, without giving too much away? We want people to go out and buy your book. What was the strangest story that you found that was maybe it had a lot of people affected, or I don't know, I'm going to let you make up your mind. Is there one that was like so strange it was like, I can't even believe it happened?
Yeah, one interesting one, and I guess it's my favorite, partly because the ghost has such a wonderful name. That's the clanking ghost of East Barnet. So East Barnet, a small village fairly near London, in the south of England. And a lot of these ghost panics, they sort of emerge in a place where there is already a ghostly legend. And in this case, the clanking ghost of East Barnet was supposed to be the ghost of a baron from medieval times who was killed in battle, and he was called Sir Geoffrey de Mandeville. So there were rumors that he haunted this area near the village of East Barnet. And so we already had this ghost legend then. In 1926, a watchman was guarding some building materials one night, and he saw this strange figure in a red cloak, a red military cavalry cloak, and the figure was a complete skeleton wearing a cloak.
Ooh.
So this is quite scary, and this started to appear in the newspapers. And once it started to appear in the newspapers, this story, it led to people meeting in the streets to, hoping that they were going to see the ghost. So this was Christmas 1926 when this started to kick off. And then every night as Christmas grew nearer, more and more people would gather in the streets hoping to see this ghost. Now, the night watchman later told papers that he hadn't seen a ghost and the story was untrue, and it's not sure whether he made it up or the workmen made it up or whatever, but it didn't matter. Now you had dozens and then hundreds of people gathering in the street. And then suddenly the newspapers reported that the ghost of the clanking ghost of East Barnet had got a girlfriend, a ghost called the Grey Lady, who was also joining him. So suddenly it was all getting romantic. And the clanking ghost of East Barnet was a robber baron from medieval times, and so it was said that this Grey Lady had come to offer herself in marriage to try and placate his troubled soul. And things oh, by the way, what was quite interesting was the local council got involved, and they had a debate about whether watchmen in near haunted locations should be paid extra, should be paid danger money for guarding haunted locations. But this spread in 1926, and then 1927, 1928, more and more people descended on this village every Christmas. And on the one hand, you might get sort of serious ghost hunters, or you might call them psychic investigators, modeled on the Society for Psychical Research, who are trying to be methodical and scientific and use telephones to keep in touch with each other at different lookout points, and with their cameras and lights and everything. And on the other hand, you had spiritualists who were trying to contact the ghost using mediums. But in the middle of that, you had hundreds and hundreds of drunk party goers who were there for like a ghost hunting party. So they'd be running around with sticks and pitchforks, screaming and shouting and scaring each other. Meanwhile, you've got these other people trying to conduct these investigations and getting really angry with each other that their investigations were being spoiled by these hordes of drunken party goers. So by the 1930s, you had thousands of people in the street every Christmas. It's hard to imagine now that people would do that, but they descended on the street every Christmas for this riotous party. And the Society for the New Barnet Research Society was just getting sick of them. They were afraid that these hordes were going to scare away the ghosts that they were trying to investigate. So now you had the ghosts being scared of people. And the last one was 1945. That was when it seemed to stop, when the ghost hunts seemed to stop. That's when the clanking ghost of East Barnet seemed to hang up his clanking spurs. But yeah, that was one of the most interesting ones, because just the sheer scale of it and the fact that it happened every year, and the cool name that the ghost had.
Well, you know what it is? I was thinking, we got a question from Kat and answer or ask in just a minute, because I was thinking, like, with that going on that long, and alcohol can make you a little more prone to a few things, not just physically, but energetically as well. But I'm wondering, with the collective belief and the amount of people that, kept coming, something can develop from that. Like, I'll take the example of Slenderman. That was a creepypasta story. And then people started drawing it and talking about it and forming groups about it and building up this talk and the fear of it. And now people are getting pictures and video, and this is before AI. But then again, it stopped. Like, do you think it was the end of the war that got people to stop? Or
I wonder if it was the end of the war, 1940s. And the other possibility is that it continued on a smaller scale, and the newspapers stopped reporting it. The newspapers lost interest. So, that is another possibility.
Yeah, because for it to go on for 3 decades almost, and then all of a sudden just kind of, yeah, okay, we're done. That's a long time for something like that to go on. Now, Kat was asking, is this hysteria similar to the Salem witch trials? with the girls saying they were hexed, I guess during the same, when we were talking about mass hysteria, I guess is what she's referring to. I guess she's saying, is it akin to the hysteria about these ghosts and, having made it up and what have you?
Yeah, I think it is. I think there is a similarity. I suppose what makes things like the Halifax slasher slightly different, I think it's the same sort of mechanism at work, but what we're getting is that we've got modern communication technology in the 30s. We've got newspapers, we've got cars, which means that it can travel faster and wider. So the whole episode lasted a couple of weeks in 1938. I think with the Salem witch trial, I presume that lasted rather longer. The accusations and the back and forth.
So
but
I was
yeah,
going.
it's a good point, and I think there is the same kind of mechanism behind some of these scares.
But that does happen throughout history, right? Like it's mass hysteria, and like you said, adding multimedia. Like even look at how popular the paranormal has grown with having TV shows out there and ghost hunting shows and what have you, right? It's almost. I don't think it's quite what it maybe was back in the. I can't say I didn't live back then in the 1920s, but still, like people are rabid about it. And I'm not being mean to anybody or disrespecting anybody, but people are really, really interested again. But we have the internet, right? And news travels quick and pictures and video. So you can see what, and always the media, I believe, is given a little bit more credence to something like that, right? If they're putting it in the paper, it must be true. Especially, I would think back in the day, and I'm not saying that, it's sort of a thought that people would have. Well, if it's in the paper, this is serious kind of thing, right?
Yeah, that's right. I think one interesting thing about these ghost panics, when is that, and cases with the Halifax slasher as well, is that there was the media was limited. So that means if you wanted to find out about it, you had to go to the location. And so that created its own kind of energy, because people would go to the place where they'd heard the rumors of the ghost. And so they'd start, more and more people would come, and it would become a kind of social event where people would, exchange stories about the supernatural or theories about what the ghost was or who it was, and that kind of thing. And, the newspapers at the time would be very, very scathing about the people who turned up to, hunt for these sort of drunken ghost hunts, but saying, how can we live in the age of steam? How can people believe such superstitious nonsense? They were saying all that kind of thing, but I don't think that they understood it correctly, because I think a lot of people were either believers or skeptics or somewhere in between, but they went there because it was a social event and they loved ghost stories and it was exciting, and they'd meet their friends, they'd sort of play tricks on their friends, they'd have a kind of party, and there'd be something spooky and scary at the same time.
Yeah, because I knew that there were, I was telling you before we went on air that Carrie Lynn and I talked about Victorian ghost stories, during Christmas, and how many there were out there. And, I just I don't see how ghosts and Christmas go together, but obviously a lot of people like to talk about that, right? And it gives you another reason why, I guess, to get together over the holidays too, right?
Yeah, it's the whole Christmas ghost thing's quite an interesting one. I mean, some people say that because Christmas is folklorists use the word liminal, don't they, to sort of describe that space between where two worlds meet, like between the land and the sea, or between sleep and wakefulness, or life and death, or all these places. And Christmas is that sort of boundary between the new year and the old year. So it seems the sort of, the ideal place where worlds would bleed into each other and merge with each other, and sort of boundaries are sort of places where interesting and strange things happen. So I think that sort of feeds into why people like Christmas ghost stories. But when people gather around the fire, in a campsite, even any time when people sort of sit around together and start telling each other stories, at some point it turns to a scary story. Do you want to hear something really scary? That turns out that happens at sleepovers when kids do it, and all these kinds of events. It's it's a way of bonding, and it's a way of sharing stories and scaring each other.
Well, I'm going to read a few comments in a few minutes. So hang in there, guys, and thanks for being here. I don't like scary things. My house that I lived in previously, if I hadn't lived it, I wouldn't have believed some of the stuff that happened in it. I don't like scary movies. Like, even if I've seen a really suspenseful movie, and I know what's going to happen, I still can't sit still. Like, because I just can't sit because I can feel like the suspense building. But people do like ghost stories. You were right. And with the paranormal, I found, especially when we were going through with what we were going through in our home, I said it was very isolating because it's not like you could be standing in queue or, in line at the grocery store and talk, just in generalities about the paranormal. And I've always found that because I don't even tell people what I do unless they ask, because I find you'll get a group of people and you don't bring it up, but then somebody will kind of just nudge the door open a bit. It's kind of like you said, when I hear something really strange that I saw in the sky or what happened to me the other day, and then another person joins in, and before you know it, 90% of the group at least has had something weird, strange, or unexplainable happen to them. So I could see that.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and it's always, you ask anyone, tell us something weird that happened to you, and you'll find an interesting story there.
Well, we got a few people from the UK tuning in tonight. We got Tina Lumisol. She says, so loving these stories from places I know so well, but had no idea. Thank you, Paul, for sharing. And I'm going to say hi to a few people popped in while we were talking. So just give me a sec. I waved to them, but just so we can say hi. So we have Channeled by Angel saying hi to everybody. Let's see. We got Benno from Oz, and he's saying happy Christmas to both of us. We got Julie Jean Bassett. You guys check her out. An amazing animal communicator, animal healer, shamanic practitioner. She's fantastic. If you don't know what to get as a last minute gift, I'm telling you, check her out, because you can find her either at juliejeanbassett.com or whitetailshamanichealing.com. It's wonderful gift for somebody that's got pets or missing them or needs some healing, or even for yourself. She's really incredible. Let me see. I'm going through here. We got Benno saying, I think you're talking about Carrie Lynn. He says, Carrie Lynn is a good psychic. Saw that the other day. No, a medium, incredible medium. Yes, Carrie Lynn should have her own TV show. She is that incredible. Let's see. I saw a few other people here. I think we got everybody. If I missed you, please let me know. Just put your name down there. I'll make sure to shout you out. So have you had a personal, like, paranormal experience yourself, though, too? Because I'm always fascinated by, you just have complete different types of paranormal, I've noticed, because where you live in the UK is much older than North America. So I'd love to hear, if you feel like sharing, have you had your own personal strange or unexplained?
Well, mine was, it's quite a strange one, really. And it didn't happen in the UK. It was when I was living and working in Greece. So
Wow.
when I was a young man, I was an English teacher in a town in northern Greece in the Balkan Mountains. And I'd moved into a new flat there. And on the first night, I was asleep, and then suddenly the bedroom light clicked on like this.
Okay.
So that was a bit unnerving, because, I had to get out of bed and walk to the other side of the room to turn it off. And I thought, is there someone in the flat? But, there wasn't. And later on the same night, it turned on again. And, I asked someone at work who knew about electronics, is that the sort of thing that's possible? And he said, no, maybe it's haunted, he said, as a joke. And then the next night I sort of woke up and saw this sort of shadowy figure at the end of the bed. And thinking it was an intruder, I grabbed the pillow, held it in front of me in case he had a knife, and sort of let to attack him, and then just found that, there was nothing there. And then again, the light came on while I was asleep. And then on the third night, I woke up and there was this, I had this sort of terrifying feeling of not being able to breathe. There was something heavy on my chest, and I could see this horrible, grinning, demonic faced, chimpanzee faced demon sort of grinning in my face as it was crushing the life out of me. And, eventually it dissipated. So I imagine a lot of people have had a similar experience, and I couldn't really explain it, but if you've ever heard of a condition called sleep paralysis, that
Oh yeah.
seems, and when I heard of that, where you sort of, you're in a strange world where you're sort of, your body's paralyzed because that's what happens when you dream. So you don't act out your dream, but your mind's awake, and it's accompanied by horrible hallucinations. For me, I think that's what happened to me. I was living in Greece, so it meant I was having a siesta in the daytime because it was hot, and then it was sort of disrupting my sleep, and so I had, I've never had it before or since, but I think I suffered from a couple of episodes of sleep paralysis. But the strange thing was, as for the light turning on and off, I noticed a few days later that many Greek houses have a second light switch at the level of the bed. So there was another light switch hidden behind the blankets on the bed, and I was kicking it with my knee every night, and that's what was turning the light on. So my ghost story has a kind of Scooby-Doo explanation at the end where, it didn't turn out, thankfully, to be what I thought it was. But, it's the sleep paralysis. It's quite an interesting topic because it sort of seems to vary from culture to culture, with some seeing witches, some seeing demons, shadowy figures at the end of the bed is a very common one. And so it all depends on, do you take that as being a kind of a sleep pathology, a hallucination, or is it something else? Is it the way, the other world sort of reaches in and tries to make contact?
Mm-hmm. Well, I've had sleep paralysis. I've not had it here, but I had it in my own house. No, the previous home that was haunted, and we knew what was in there. And I'm writing a book about it because I'm serious, and I documented a lot of stuff because I thought nobody is ever going to believe me with some of the things that happen. And it was on my birthday, and I kept waking up and something was choking me, and I kept getting out of bed. And as soon as I would get away from the bedroom and start to try and get up the stairs, it would stop. It happened 3 times. It was the only time. I didn't have a hallucination, but we really had awful things in our house. Like there's, I think have you met Jason Bland from Paranormal Soup?
Yes.
I thought so. I thought I seen you on there. Okay, he's a friend of mine. I used to call into his show a lot, and we were on a previous network together. And I share EVPs from his show. Both of them are Halloween shows from 2017, 2018. And I happened to call in. I was watching, actually, it was Linkin Park's memorial concert for Chester Bennington. I thought, oh crap, I missed the Halloween show. There's 5 minutes. I'll call back in or call in to say hi. And Jason got an extra half hour. What came through on that recording is not that you need headphones to hear. It is the most insane communication. It sounds like something with a snaky, raspy voice, and it told me to shut up. It then kept saying, I'm searching, and it is so clear. It is one of the creepiest EVPs I have ever heard. And it was done live. It wasn't planned, and it was from the most active part of my house. And we had all my husband was thrown 15 feet across the kitchen, bites, scratches, burns. And again, I never had this happen in any other house. I've had high strangeness around me my whole life, but that for all of it to happen in that home, there were and my partner to this day is a skeptic, because somebody had, or Benno had added good detective work when you had shared your story, because I think it's imperative that we have to go in with trying to debunk what causes the strange and unusual, right? We can't, because I find there's a lot of people, and I'm not being disrespectful, but because of TV, right away, it's a demon, like they're hiding around every corner, right? That's not quite how it is. So I say good detective work too, really good detective work. So
it's important to keep an open mind, and that with any story, it's the closer you can get to the original source, the better it is. The more you can find out, because every author who sort of writes a book about something, they add a little bit, whether they they want to or not. It's just part of the process. So going back and back and back and trying to find the original source of strange reports is always a good idea.
Well, I just thought I'm going to go through some of the things that you, Gavin, had shared here. So one thing I had seen here, it says playing the ghost. in the 19th and early 20th century, dressing as a ghost, sometimes in elaborate, luminous costumes, and scaring people at night was a common activity, especially at Christmas. So what can you tell us about that? Why always Christmas again? Like, it kind of sounds...
It's hard to imagine now because, imagine you're walking down a street at night, maybe you're coming home from the pub, it's a dark winter's night, and you see this strange figure doing sort of ghost-like poses, standing near the graveyard, and you can see quite clearly that it's actually somebody with a sheet over his head, or maybe with a devil mask and some splashes of luminous paint. But what would you do? Would you run for your life? Maybe because of the set and the setting and the graveyard, and you might think it's a real ghost, and it might terrify you out of your wits, or you might approach it and, like some people did, and give the ghost a thump. But this activity of sort of putting a strange costume on and hiding in a scary place was rife throughout the 19th century and early 20th century. Certainly in Britain, I would have thought there would be similar episodes in Canada, the US as well. There certainly were in Australia. But when people did this, and sometimes it would just be a sheet over their head. Sometimes they cover themselves in luminous paint, or, a devil mask or a calf mask. Sometimes when people did this, it would lead to these gangs of vigilantes forming to try and catch the ghost hoaxer. I can't stress how common this was. It happened in every town around the country. And so these gangs would form to try and catch the ghost. And if they did, they'd probably beat him to a pulp. They might throw him in a nearby river or sewer. There's one lovely example from the late 19th century where this ghost had been terrifying the village. And so the whole village came together and formed this kind of patrol group, and they went walking around the village at night with clubs. And when they saw the ghost sitting on a gate, they sort of all charged after him, started bashing him with their clubs. And one woman pulled a sheet off his head, only to discover that she'd fractured the skull of her own husband.
Oh my gosh!
Village. He was all right, apart from his fractured skull. But you never know what your husbands are up to when you don't have your eye on them. But so there are loads of stories like that where these sort of hoaxes would get out of hand with gangs of vigilantes, and quite often these gangs of vigilantes would dress in drag. You can't imagine this now. So you'd have these sort of burly farmers or villagers dressed as women, because they thought, the ghost hoaxer would try and scare women more than men. So they were trying to honey trap the ghost. So you can imagine how it would be almost like a kind of a rugby club night out, with all these drunk men dressed as women, making fun of each other, and then rolling around the streets drunk, trying to attract the ghost. So they were really carnivalesque sort of affairs, these drunken nocturnal ghost hunts in drag.
Yeah, I saw that. Well, actually, my eldest son, I had two boys. I have one now. He does drag part-time. So when I was watching that, or was reading that, I was going, drag that. And like you said, these are big, burly men. So did they ever, I got to ask you with your research, did they ever fool any of the hoaxing ghosts that were out there? Were they attracted and thinking it was a woman?
No.
I didn't think so. I don't think they'd be too passable, right?
I don't think they were. No. I think you can imagine them squeezing into their wife's or their sister's best frock. And it never seemed to work, but it didn't stop them trying.
Yeah, because I'm nowadays, especially even when people try to, there's vigilantism is so strongly discouraging. You could see why. Like, I was just horrified when you said this woman hit the ghost over the head with a club and then realized it was her husband. Oh my God.
Yeah, I mean, there were some cases where it went even worse. There was the Hammersmith ghost, which is one of the earliest ones. This happened at Christmas 1803, New Year 1804, and this ghost had supposedly scared a pregnant woman to death. And, he's described as being a guy in a white sheet. Sometimes he had red eyes, or he could breathe fire. And Sometimes he had a devil mask. The story about the pregnant woman turned out not to be true. It was sort of a misreporting by the newspaper. But, it created such a sense of hysteria that people were afraid to go out. And then one man, an excise man, decided he was going to take the law into his own hands, and he waited on a dark lane for the ghost to appear with a shotgun in his hand. And when this figure in white came out of the mist, he challenged him, and the figure in white didn't answer, so he opened fire and shot him. And it turns out he shot a young man who was a plasterer by trade, and plasterers wore all white clothes, and so this led to a huge uproar in the in Hammersmith in London. First, they'd been terrified by this ghost hoaxer. Then they'd been shocked by this tragic killing. And so hundreds and hundreds of people were sort of crammed into the trial. The guy who shot him was found guilty, sentenced to death, and then at the last minute given a reprieve. And he ended up only serving 7 months. But the strange thing is that while he was in prison awaiting trial, the newspapers reported that the real Hammersmith ghost had been caught, and he was a shoemaker called John Graham. And what John Graham said was that, he admitted he'd done it once, only once, and that he'd done it because his apprentice had been telling his children ghost stories, and now they were too scared to sleep, so he wanted to get his own back on the apprentice and give him a taste of his own medicine. So he hung about in the streets and scared the life out of his apprentice. But he was made a scapegoat, and he became known as the real Hammersmith ghost. But it's pretty clear from the different descriptions that there were many different people doing this throughout London at the same time. So that's why the descriptions of the ghost hoaxer were all different. My favorite one, on Christmas Eve, 1803, Christmas Day, 1803, a coachman was riding his coach past this meadow, moonlit night, and he heard this eerie rattling noise. So he jumped out to see what it was, and he saw this strange figure all in white that was covered from head to foot in pig's bladders that were filled with dried peas that were making this rattling noise. Now, pig's bladders filled with dried peas, those were common children's toys at the time. That was the PlayStation 2 of its day.
Oh my God. Well, I just would think when though, well, mind you, there's people that are adrenaline junkies, because if it gets bigger and bigger every year, and people are going out in packs as vigilantes, plus there's alcohol mixed in, I wouldn't want to be doing that in case you got caught or hurt or something, right? Plus all you think you're doing is performing to scare a bunch of people. Yeah, I don't know why you would want to continue to do that.
It's quite strange what the motivation is. I mean, people have a sense of mischief, that's for sure, and people enjoy practical jokes. But I guess some of them must have been adrenaline junkies, because they would have to be really fast. They'd have to know the local area. They'd be able to rip off their disguise and and hide. Some ghosts apparently would have a costume that was white on one side and black on the other, so they could just turn it inside out and then hide easily.
That's a good idea. Now, when you mentioned about Canada, no, I haven't gone far enough back in Canada, but I don't. And if anybody's here that remembers that's in Canada, or I know people are here from Australia as well, I don't remember hearing about something like that during that time. But it doesn't mean it didn't exist. Like I remember, it was called the mummers, but they weren't ghosts. They used to just dress up from ridiculous clothing and stuff. It was a tradition. And then you probably know about it, and go from door to door. And it was kind of a big fun thing. And I remember Carrie Lynn sent me something, because it's done apparently still in Newfoundland, one of our provinces. But I can't remember, again, thinking if I've heard of anything like that with ghosts. Because when
I think it's because it's a forgotten piece of history, that it's very little known in this country as well. It's just it's something that we used to do that we don't seem to do anymore. I mean, there might be some parallels of similar hoaxing going on, but the idea of dressing in what's really a very basic ghost costume, a sheet over your head for a lot of people, isn't going to convince anyone. But dressing in such a basic ghost costume and then hanging around and scaring people, it's not something we do anymore very much. But also, I also think gathering in places where there've been ghost rumors is also something that people don't do as much now, because they can go to the internet, they can watch it on TV. So because what you often get is that there'd be reports of a ghost, and then you'd get hundreds and then thousands of people cramming into a graveyard waiting to see the ghost. And there's an interesting one that happened near where I live, in a city called Bradford in West Yorkshire. This was in 1868, where a guy wrote a letter to a newspaper saying he'd seen this strange red-eyed ghost walking around the cathedral. And so the next night, there were 8,000 people.
Oh my gosh!
Crammed into this graveyard. And they were all sort of throwing, running around over the graves, throwing clumps of earth at each other and screaming, making ghost noises, jumping out on each other and scaring their friends. But the police completely lost control. They had to get the fire brigade in to turn their hoses on these 8,000 drunken ghost hunters to get them all to go home. And these sort of graveyard ghost hunting riots were really common. There were quite a few spread out over the 19th and early 20th century.
Like that's just blowing my mind. Like, talk about news traveling fast. Because go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. So that's what the newspapers did. That they gave people, and especially the kind of letter that happened in Bradford. It said, this ghost always starts at 7:30 on Wells Street near the cathedral. So everybody knew where to be and when to be.
Right. Actually, Benno says, was it the drunk vicar Paul?
You might wonder.
Well, it almost sounds like they were all waiting for a performance when you just said it. The ghost usually starts at this time on this street. Oh my God. Well, plus with Charles Dickens writing, right? Well, I know it as Scrooge now, but the Ghost of Christmas Past, right? Present and future. Did you find anything like that? Like people writing up, creating stories around that? We couldn't find much information in it around it because we wanted to know, was he the only one that featured stories of these types of ghosts? But even with the hoaxes, did anybody try and kind of act out something like that or pretend? It sounds like it was mostly with a white sheet though, wasn't it?
It was mostly with a white sheet. Quite a few added luminous paint, which was easily available at the time, so that would have made it extra kind of, and you got to imagine it would be much darker in those days, so it would have been a little bit scarier. And now, I mean, some costumes were pretty pathetic. There was one case that happened in Dundee in Scotland, where a young lad put two wooden crates on top of each other and then wrapped them in newspaper. And then he told a young girl in the street, hey, look, there's a ghost over there. And she collapsed in fits, terrified of it. And so, he got into trouble. So people took a very dim view about it, especially because occasionally, it had tragic consequences. Yeah, some of the costumes were described as, there was one that had a luminous hat. We told you about the guy in the pig's bladders.
I can't believe that. Wow.
I know. What a costume.
I'm still just blown away that there, and like I said, there's people from the UK in the chat that said, like Tina said, she's from the same area and she never even heard of any of these stories from then. And again, there could have been, because I mean, we had the Victorian age over here around the same time. I know we did. So there probably was, something to that effect, but I can't remember ever seeing anything. I'm going to have to look.
Yeah, the strange thing is that it really hasn't been studied very much by academics. I know there is he may be Australian or New Zealand, I'm sorry if I've got that wrong, but a professor who studied some in that part of the world. But it just hasn't really been studied before. That's why I sort of became obsessed with them, because it reflects, our love for the supernatural, for ghost stories, but also there's something about the mischief involved and the way the community gets swept up in this panic. So it sort of draws all these things together. And, and a lot of these panics, they have a kind of ghost folklore attached to them. So it brings in folklore elements as well.
Well, I keep thinking too, because back in the day, what did you see if someone was drawing a ghost? Something in a white sheet, right, with holes cut through. Like that's what I remember. I'm 60, but as a child, remember seeing if you're going to see a picture of a ghost, that's what a ghost looked like in a white sheet. I'm wondering if it came from that time period, right?
Yeah, you wonder. I mean, I think a lot of it maybe came from the early days of photography when people started spirit photographs, and you can look these up online. 19th century spirit photographs, they're all sort of transparent and floaty, and I think that sort of gave people the idea that a ghost should be sort of floaty and transparent, with the white sheet being the winding sheet. I mean, strangely, there's an abbey in North Yorkshire called Byland Abbey, and a medieval monk there collected true ghost stories from the nearby village and wrote them down on bits of spare paper. And the ghosts as far as Yorkshire people were concerned back in medieval days, they weren't sort of airy fairy floaty. They were real physical corpses who came back from the grave. They were more like zombies in some ways. There was one where he reported how a priest came back from the grave and wandered around scaring everyone in the village. And when this happened, what they would do is they'd have to get a priest to conjure this revenant, or whatever you want to call it, this zombie, to conjure him and say, in the name of God, tell me who you are. And it turns out this priest had a guilty conscience because in his past life he'd stolen some spoons, and so he was walking the earth guilty at his terrible crime, and the spoons were returned to the rightful owner, and the priest went back to his grave. So the way we think about ghosts has changed a lot over the centuries, from these very strange medieval ghosts where I guess the Catholic idea of purgatory fed into it, where they had to do their penance, they had to walk the earth until their sins had been paid.
I guess, because I'm thinking as you're talking, did you find with your research, with all of these hoaxes, was there actually, now of course we can probably prove it, but there actually was a report of an actual specter figure, if you will, that they found out it really wasn't a human being dressing up? Did you come across any kind of stories like that?
Not really for this book, because for this book I was focused on ghost hunts, ghost hoaxes, and ghost panic. So those were the ones I
just thought when you were researching, and then I was wondering, like, if there was a case where everybody thought it was a hoax, right? You're looking for the hoax in it, and all of a sudden, last paragraph, but nobody was able to catch who this hoaxer was, and it's believed it was really a specter or a real spirit.
In a lot of them, nobody caught the ghost. He was either too fast. There weren't any in the ones that I looked at where it turned out, there really was a ghost or something like that, because really I was looking for this phenomenon called playing the ghost. Now, maybe in some of the stories you could argue, like we talked about Geoffrey de Mandeville, the clanking ghost of East Barnet, that was already existing ghost lore at the time. So, you could argue maybe there's a hole there where you might say the real ghost could live. But yeah, really, I suppose, because when I was thinking about this book, I thought I'd love to write a book about true Christmas ghost stories, but when I looked, there's hundreds of them, so I had to look somewhere else. And so thinking about these ghost hoaxes that I'd seen all over the newspapers as I was sort of swimming in the newspaper archives, researching other stuff, I just started putting them together, and I thought, a lot of these seem to happen at Christmas, and that's what led me to put them together. So really the ones I've focused on are hoaxes where, sometimes very crude hoaxes with a simple white sheet over the head, but they sort of spiraled out of control in strange and bizarre ways.
I cannot believe that 8,000 people showed up. It was in the paper one day, and the next day 8,000 people were there. That is crazy. And you're getting quite the compliments in the chat. Benno just said, Paul is amazing. And he is. He's so interesting, isn't it, you guys? Give me just 1 sec. I got to do my station ID. Thanks, Kevin, for reminding me. We're supposed to do it at the top of the hour, but when I'm having a good conversation, I don't want to end it. So give me just a sec here. If you're just tuning in, you are listening to or watching live UFO Paranormal and United Public Radio Network. And this is the Angel Rock. I'm your host, Lorilei Potvin. And my guest here is Paul Weatherhead. We have to thank him too, you guys. It's late over in the UK, and he stayed up to join us tonight, which we really, really appreciate. And we're talking about his book. I want to make sure I get it all right here. Give me a sec. I want to get the title. Phantoms of Christmas Past. Festive ghost hoaxes, ghost hunts, and ghost panics. And I'm telling you, some of these stories are just mind-blowing. And then the imagination behind people. And like I said, you'd have to be an adrenaline junkie once the vigilante started. Like, why would you even want to do it? You know that you're going to get injured. Like, people are going to really seriously hurt you if you're doing it. So,
yeah, it's a strange thing because, you know, one of the in the case of the Hammersmith ghost, we know he confessed that he did it to scare his apprentice out of revenge. You know, I found a couple of cases where one rare case where the ghost hoaxer was a woman, and she did it because she'd had an argument with a boyfriend, and so there was that. But most of the time, it's very hard to find a motive apart from what can only be the thrill of the chase, the idea of doing it, scaring people, and then sort of making a successful getaway.
Yeah, because again, well, it depends what your belief systems are too, right? Because a lot of people believe the veil is at Halloween. And did you find it was there a religious factor to this as well, Paul? Like, was there more incidences, say, depending on what your religious belief system was?
Okay, sorry, I missed the first part of the question.
Hopefully you're
you
still
dropped
there.
out for a little
or did
bit
I freeze
there.
on you? Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I probably did. Instagram quit on me, and it'll do that. What I was asking was, did you, I'm going to set it up, but I'll ask you this question first. Did you find with your research, was there any particular religious influence where we saw more of this, or was it just geographical area, or what's your consensus on that?
That's interesting. Yeah. Because there were some cases where the social and religious background were important. And I'm thinking of the case of the Lochie ghost, which is Dundee in Scotland. So that's another area where there was a kind of a ghost legend already about an Indian princess who died a horrible death, and she haunted the location. And so when someone started dressing up as a ghost and prancing around in scary locations, that the population, who were mostly Irish Catholics who'd come over to this part of Scotland during the potato famine. And so there was a huge Irish community there. They called it Little Tipperary. And so there would have been a sort of a Catholic element to that. And so they, again, formed gangs running around the streets trying to catch the ghost. It was, you know, that this ghost was the one with a luminous hat and a sort of a long white luminous coat, and you know, they chased the ghost around the street. They could never catch it. There were loads of cases of mistaken identity, and innocent people were beaten up because people assumed they were the ghost. Maybe they were running for an appointment, and people thought, oh, he must be the ghost escaping. So they all went after him, and you know, the panic got to such an extent that people were worried that marriages weren't happening anymore because courting couples were too scared to go out and meet each other. So I think there might have been an element of, you know, a singular, isolated immigrant community there where, you know, that was focused on this. Interestingly, with this one, there was a kind of Scooby-Doo twist to it because people with their dogs set out to try and catch the ghost. And one little terrier called Nettle chased the ghost, chased him down, and managed to pull the sheet off him and reveal the culprit. So, you know, and it just feel like saying, if it wasn't for you pesky kids, he would have got away with it. But it all ended with a wee Scooby-Doo catching the ghost.
That's pretty funny. No, we got a question from Kevin, or Z-Sun Dragon. He says, I keep looking at the figurines on the shelf behind Paul. Would love to hear their story.
Oh, well, there's a strange selection there. One of them is a little model of me with a guitar, which was
That's cool.
made by my wife. The other one is an automaton, which is a weird Japanese musical instrument where you squeeze its mouth and it opens like that, and you there's a little fretboard that you run your finger down. There's a toy accordion. I don't know how I came to have that, and then a couple of percussion instruments, and then other bits and pieces on the other side. I'm a musician when I'm not chasing ghost hoaxes.
I was going to say you must be, because they're all talking about this. It's Mish. Hi, Mish. I didn't get a chance to say hi. She's from Australia. I always like to tease my Australian friends are watching from the future because it's already Tuesday morning over there. And they're all talking about they look like they want to move. Everybody's thinking the pieces want to move behind you. I don't know why, but that's what they're talking about in the chat.
I'm sure they do when I turn the lights out.
So there was how about this one, the Islington Graveyard Riot 1899. Would you like to tell us about that one?
Yeah, that was 1899. A guy wrote a letter to a newspaper saying that on Christmas night 1899 he'd seen this ghost floating around the graveyard of the church, and he said, tonight, the next night, I'm going to go there and investigate. And so it was almost like, an investigation to a ghost hunt. The next night, hundreds of people descended after the pubs had closed, obviously descended on the graveyard. And a bit like we've talked about before, you had this sort of wild, drunken party with people chasing each other and scaring each other, making ghostly noises and screaming and jumping out on each other. The police just again lost control, and these riot ghosts, as we said, these sort of graveyard ghost hunting drunken riots were quite common. There was an even bigger one in London a few years before that, but in this case, strangely enough, the police went to the address of the person who'd written the letter to the newspaper, and no one of that name existed there, and the police conclusion was that the letter had been written by a pickpocket who knew that by saying there's going to be a ghost tonight in this cemetery, you'd get hundreds of people there for a drunken ghost hunt, and it'd be very easy to sort of jostle among the crowd and relieve people of their valuables without them noticing. And a few people did come. There were scuffles and all kinds of fights and misbehavior, and a few people came home, without their wallets or their watches. And this was a common thought at the time, that some of these rumors may have been started deliberately by criminals to try and get a large number of drunk people together in a small area where they can easily pick their pockets.
Well, it would definitely be easy pickings if they're all drunk.
Sure.
It would. Yeah. I'm also thinking a lot of these involve, it sounds like the cemetery. I'm wondering if that's where some of the legend and lore comes from with the fear about cemeteries to this day. Because I know I've heard lots of stories of people, the cemetery, especially at night after midnight, it's the worst place to be, right? People think you're all kinds of bad things, or they're going to get really, you're going to run into a spirit, or you're going to be spooked really badly. Do you think that maybe that's where some of that legend and lore from it came from around that time?
It must be, yeah. And of course, it is the ideal place for something spooky to happen. Your mind is going to turn to morbid thoughts and, mouldering graveyards and, bare winter trees and the moonlight on a crumbling church. It's all very atmospheric, and so it all contributes to the story, to the, and to how you're going to feel when you see whatever it is you see.
Well, that's what I'm asking you, because my mind's working as we're talking, that a lot of the stuff that we associate early days, like I said, a ghost, like people still make figurines. If it's a ghost, it's easily recognizable. If it's a white sheet with black holes and a mouth, most people recognize the ghost, right? And then the cemetery, like there's and clanking chains and it still kind of exists, even though people aren't necessarily hoaxing the way they were. It seems like some of the phenomena still persists.
Yeah, those sort of it's almost like the kind of ghost you'd see in a cartoon, isn't it? This Casper the
Yeah.
Friendly Ghost and that kind of thing. It's strange how it's sort of become the symbol of a ghost, that such a simple thing, the
Mhm.
sheep with the eye holes. Interestingly, there was one case in Deal in Kent in 1926 where there was a rumor of that every 5th of November a ghost would appear in the nearby graveyard, and there was an army barracks there. So one soldier decided to test the nerves of the guy who was on sentry duty. So
Yeah.
on the 5th of November, he threw a sheet over his head and started prancing around in front of the sentry. And, he succeeded in scaring the sentry, and the sentry drew his bayonet. But, the ghost had forgotten to cut eye holes in the tablecloth, and he
Oh
staggered
no.
onto the bayonet because he was drunk.
Oh
Uh,
no.
and so the paper took this as the perfect time to moralize about the evils of practical jokes and dressing up as ghosts and everything. But yeah.
Oh wow. Well, another story, I'll read it here, that was shared from Gavin when he had sent your info to me. I just lost it. Give me a sec. The ghost of King Richard III on New Year's Eve. It says, on New Year's Eve, 1921, a farmer encountered the luminous green ghost of King Richard III at the site of his final battle. The colorful tale caused a sensation in the national press and disquiet among the villagers as more rumors of King Dick's wandering ghost spread. Journalists, ghost hunters, and psychic investigators duly followed. What can you tell us about that one?
Yeah, that's an interesting one because King Richard III, of course, in the Shakespeare play, there's quite a bit of ghost lore attached to that. So, King Richard on the day before his last battle, the culmination of the War of the Roses. When was it?
Right.
1485, I think. But the day before his last battle, he sort of is alone in his tent. He drinks some wine, and then the ghosts of all the people who he's done away with on his way to the throne appear before him. And so there is that association of King Richard III with ghosts. And he goes into battle, and he's he dies famously shouting, my horse, a kingdom for a horse." And he died on a place called Ambion Hill in Leicestershire. And strangely enough, there doesn't seem to have been any ghostly legends about him. And you would have thought there would have been, a violent death, a sort of a famous villain in history, if you believe the Lancastrian propaganda. But any case, there doesn't seem to have been any sort of ghostly legends about him until the early 20s, when a local newspaper wrote a story saying on New Year's Eve, this farmer was going home from the pub. There's a bit of a theme developing here. Going home from the pub, and he took a shortcut through the woods, and he saw this green mist, and inside the green mist there was the figure of a ghost, humpbacked and ugly and evil, with a voice like a rusty key in an old lock, who said, "I'm the
Yeah.
ghost." He spoke in cod Shakespeare, and "I'm the ghost of Richard III, and every New Year's Eve I come and fight my last battle again on Ambion Hill, but I never speak to any mortal man until this day. I've come with a message for you, Mr. Farmer, to spread to the world." And the message was to tell the woodcutters to stop cutting down trees on
Oh,
this hill. And so this was published in the newspaper. Now, when you read the article, it's quite clear that it's a bit of a joke. It's very tongue-in-cheek, it's
mhm.
very sarcastic, and if you read it, you can see it's a bit of a light-hearted Christmas joke. But when other newspapers took up the story, they just summarized it and said, a farmer saw a green mist with a ghost of King Richard walking around the streets, walking around the hills of Leicestershire. And so from that, you started to get people coming down to investigate. And so you get some ghost hunters and investigators coming down on the top of it. And then even stranger, you started to get local villagers saying, "Oh yeah, I've heard about the ghost of King Richard III," even though there hadn't been any ghost lore about him before. But just that little hoax in the newspaper spread out and had all these interesting ripples. The newspaper admitted that they'd made up the story. Pretty much, and so that's unfortunately put paid to the ghost of Richard III. He is a prime candidate for a ghost. Violent death, sort of horrible actions throughout his life, and died in battle on this hill. That would be a prime place, but it didn't exist until a newspaper made it up in the 20s.
That's like I said, that people believe the newspaper. I just can't believe how fast it spread just with the newspaper. Like you could see that spreading with social media nowadays that quickly. But that's I'm still blown away that 8,000 people showed up the day after with one of the stories you shared.
Yeah.
Like that was just mind blowing. Now, Mish, she's in Australia. She shared this story before, and it's kind of funny. She says when you were talking about hoaxing a few minutes ago, she goes, like the ghost I seen in the church that turned out to be an overhead projector, and yes, I was drunk. And the way she's described it before in the chat, like it looked like it had almost a sheet over top of it, I think, didn't you, Mish? And then you realized it was a projector. But you can see how these stories grow, right? It's almost like, I don't know what you guys would call it over in the UK. I've heard it called the game of telephone. So you get a big circle of people, and one person starts and whispers in the next person to them in their ear what the word is. And they keep whispering to each other all the way around. By the time they get to the last person, it's never close to the same word that they started with, right?
That's right. Yeah, we call it Chinese whispers, but yeah, it's
I like that name.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it just reminds me of an example. I know in Canada you've got a Halifax like we have. I think you've also got a Todmorden just down the road from here. Todmorden, it's known as the UFO capital of the UK.
Ooh, okay.
It had the first abduction there, the first supposed alien abduction there in Britain. But one really nice story I found from, I think it was 1868, concerned the train station there, and this is quite Dickensian. The station master was on duty, and at midnight, and he saw this strange white figure with red eyes coming towards him, and he held his lantern up to see what it was, and he thought it must be there'd been a train crash, and this was a ghost of somebody who died in the train crash coming to tell the station that there'd been a horrible tragedy. But then after this sort of white red-eyed wraith came closer, it disappeared, and so did the station master. And so the next day, you got a crowd of people coming to the station. What's happened? What was the ghost? Where did he go? Did it drag him to hell or something? And then more and more people came every day. So you had hundreds of people. And then a couple of days later, when the station master turned up to work to see all this huge crowd of people around the station, thinking that he'd been dragged off to hell by a red-eyed ghost. And he told them that he had seen something. He said, he'd been standing on the platform at midnight, and he saw this white thing with red eyes coming towards him, and he lifted up his lantern, and his first thought was that it was a ghost, but it turned out it was an escaped ferret. It was an albino ferret with pink eyes. And so he told this to his friend, and his friend had told his friend, and his friend had told his friend, and so the story just got juicier and juicier, and the sort of until in the end, it was a red-eyed ghost who dragged the poor station master off to hell, and he'd never been seen again. So, and this was over a couple of days. It shows just how fast these stories can grow.
Well, they do, though, right? Because one friend tells a friend, and that tells two friends, and it grows. But it does. A lot of people are saying, especially from Australia, they call it Chinese whispers as well. That game. I like that name better than the game of telephone. I like Chinese whispers. That sounds better. Absolutely. So now you mentioned, I know I'm veering off a little bit, the UFO capital, you said?
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about that? For those, like, I've never been to the UK. I would love to hear a little bit about that place, like why it's known as the UFO capital.
Yeah, it started in 1980 when a police officer was doing his rounds in the early hours of the morning, and he was looking for some escaped cows, believe it or not, that were walking around the town, and he suddenly saw this strange what you'd call a spaceship type thing sitting in the road in front of him, a sort of a big diamond-shaped thing that had windows around it, and it seemed to be revolving. And he sat there for a while looking at it. And the next thing he knew, he was driving further down the road. And so, he told the police off. He told his boss, and it turned out that other police officers had seen a strange light in the sky. Although, again, as often in these cases, when you sort of pull at the threads, things start to disintegrate a little bit, because some of the officers, it was on a different night, it wasn't the same night. But in any case, he underwent hypnosis a little bit later, almost a year later, and in that he described how he'd been zapped up into this UFO, this flying saucer. And he said the occupants of the saucer included this biblical man called, in a robe and with a long beard, called Joseph. And there were these little robots. Strangely enough, there was a big black dog as well. So as far as I know, that's the only UFO with a dog on it that I've seen in the literature. And black dogs have a place in folklore, don't they?
Absolutely.
So that was quite interesting, why there would be a dog on there. And so those were the stories he told under hypnosis, and that's what sort of got Todmorden its reputation as being the alien abduction capital. It was Britain's first alien abduction. There was, interestingly, a strange murder, or a strange death that had happened, an unexplained death that had happened a few months earlier, where a Polish guy had gone missing from a city quite far away, and then he'd been found in Todmorden. People thought it was almost as if he'd been dropped from a UFO onto a pile of coal. So there was that sort of story as well that made it really complicated. So it's a really interesting story. I've only sort of scratched the surface of it here, because it has so many interesting sort of twists and turns and rabbit holes. Interestingly, one of the hypnotists who Alan Godfrey went to didn't believe he was telling the truth. He thought that he'd suffered from some kind of sleep disorder, because he'd been on a night shift, and that he'd fall. My own theory is that he fell asleep at the wheel and sort of had this sort of dream or hallucination, because he had a history of hallucinations involving dogs. That's something that's sort of left out of most modern tellings of the story, but it's a really interesting story.
Yeah, I got questions, because I'd like to know, what type of hypnosis they use, what level were they getting him down to, and, and again, even if you had a dream, though, could you, if you weren't, say, in theta wave with the hypnosis, like really deep, and you're quite lightly under hypnosis, could you be tapping into a dream that you had, right?
It could be, but the last hypnotist to hypnotize him, can I remember his name? I can't remember his name at the moment, but he was certainly one of the most prominent hypnotists in Britain at the time, and he was convinced that he wasn't hypnotized, that he was behaving in a way that he'd seen people, actors, being hypnotized in TV movies and things.
Right.
So he was sort of performing what it was like to be in a hypnotic trance. So so he disbelieved him. So there were three hypnotists. One wasn't really interested, he was retired. The second one was an utter scoundrel who got into all kinds of deviant malpractice, which I won't go into here. The third one was the most reputable in the country. But it's sort of it put Todmorden on the UFO map, and people still talk about it to this day. It's part of our local folklore, just like Roswell in the US. It's it's part of the folklore of the local area now.
Mm-hmm. Well, where I live I'm almost midway through Canada, and I'm about 40 minutes away from the Minnesota border, and it's called Thunder Bay, and we're on the shores of the biggest of the Great Lakes, Lake Superior. So you have to come through my city if you go from one part of Canada to the other, or if you don't want to go around the lakes to the United States. And we have So many tales of high strangeness, any kind of paranormal you can think of. People have either documented it or have stories. I have a file of the amount of things I have seen flying in the sky that are not planes, that are, I'm not calling them UFOs, but I certainly not a plane. It's usually red. Julie Jean Bassett, I bring her up often when I talk about this because it wasn't this November, it was November before. She had sent me a picture of the full moon. And I said, I went out to look at it and I was filming it. And I went, I got to message you back. I just saw something and it was just it was flying all over from the moon. Like it wasn't flying. And I had to blow the camera up pretty big. We've got dogmen. I had somebody send me a story. And thank God he was awake. And he didn't believe in the paranormal. He was in his mid 70s and he kept smelling burning and burning and burning and burning. And he's looking all over his flat, like he just had a little space to see what it could be. And he couldn't find anything. And he opened up his fridge. I have a picture of it. His eggs were on fire. There was no electrical fire in the fridge. You can see how many eggs he had. They were burnt into the bottom of the shelf of his fridge. And never been able to explain it. Like I know the person that contacted me was a friend of this gentleman, said they've had some really weird activity. But this place, I don't know if it's a portal or what it is, but we have got strange activity in the city.
Wow. I've never heard of spontaneously combusting eggs before. That's a new one.
I've never heard of it either. Like I had, and I have a gazillion questions. Like I had to ask, like she said, he was in his mid 70s, and I said, thank God he found it. Because what if it had happened during the middle of the night? And I asked, like, did he have the fridge checked? Like, were there any electrical shortages? Were there anything? Nothing wrong with the fridge. And I could tell how many eggs were in the carton because it's melted. They're melted right into, you know how you have sometimes a plastic tray on the bottom of the fridge, right? And then there's fruit drawers or whatever. You can see it. And I said, well, what did he do with them? She said he threw them out the window. Like he said, in all my years, he didn't believe in the paranormal, never had a weird experience, and there's no explanation why it happened. Yeah, that's right, Cat, deviled eggs. He was pretty scared because he never had something like that ever happen. So there's a lot of high strangeness in this city. So Benno was also adding, in European folklore, seeing a black dog meant one's own demise was near. Is that true?
Yeah, generally it was seen as a sign that you or somebody's demise was near. There are a few stories where the black dog sort of helps people who are lost, but generally you don't want to see one.
Well, I've noticed, because I'm a big Harry Potter fan, I read all the books before the movies came out, and I've noticed over the years that she's borrowed from quite a few different genres, the legend and the lore and things like that, right? So well, that's so interesting that I want to dig into this guy to find out, because not too many people can, I guess you could hoax somebody if you were hypnotized, especially if you've seen enough on TV, but that's fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. So I'm still is there any other stories you can think from your book that, like, I got some great examples here, but if you think of any or something you haven't talked about on a show before that you'd love to share with us about your book?
Yeah, I suppose the way that I approached it, because most of these stories tend to start round about Halloween.
Okay.
With somebody dressing up as a ghost because it's Halloween, maybe, and then it sort of hits the newspapers maybe a little bit later in November as people start to get scared and panic starts to spread, and so they tend to peak around Christmas. So I suppose that's what sort of binds them together and makes them a Christmas story, and then often they peter out over that time, and you know, that's what sort of sets them at Christmas. One interesting story that that you might be interested in, because this is one that's really hard to explain, and I came across it tangentially, really. And
Okay.
There was a famous newspaper editor called W.T. Stead. So he was really famous in the 19th century. He was like a pioneer of campaigning journalism. And he was investigating one of the poltergeists cases that are discussed in the book, but he decided not to go into it because he was suspicious when they started to ask him for lots of money to go and sort of visit the poltergeist. So he backed off. But he was an ardent spiritualist. He was a bit like, in many ways, Arthur Conan Doyle. He'd lost his son in the First World War, and that had sort of drawn him towards spiritualism. And he wrote a story in the late 19th century, a Christmas story. He published it in his newspaper. And the story was about a giant ship called the Majestic, an ocean-going liner. And this was a real ship called the Majestic, so he based it on a real ship. And the Captain Edwards, who was the captain of the ship. And in this story, two psychics on board the ship have this premonition of a disaster at sea involving an iceberg. And so they have to try and persuade the captain to sort of to go to investigate it. And so he publishes this story. This is in the late 19th century. Now, the captain of the Majestic, which remember is a real ship, Captain Edwards, was also the man who went on to captain the Titanic that went down.
No way. Okay.
And the guy who wrote the story, W.C. Stead, was one of the passengers on the Titanic. He died when the Titanic sank in 1912. So that was a strange story that sort of, it's not really a ghost story, but it has that sort of synchronicity, if you like.
Yeah, that's as soon as you said an iceberg and you heard me say no way, because I knew you had to be talking eventually about the Titanic. That is insane. So I don't mind blowing.
Yeah, it's hard to believe. The Majestic was a real ship, and the captain was the same captain who went on to captain the Titanic, and the guy who wrote the story about the premonition of a ship hitting an iceberg and sinking was a passenger on the Titanic. It's a bizarre story.
So I noticed you called some people ghost hunters of the day, and different titles for the people that showed up. So how would somebody call themselves like a ghost hunter of the day? Because if I think of a ghost hunter today, right, you've got equipment, you go out with a team. And so what would differentiate them, just say from regular people versus vigilantes versus people that call themselves ghost hunters, especially around Christmas?
Yeah, they definitely wouldn't use the word ghost hunter. They tended to be in two sort of camps. So you had the sort of investigators who modeled themselves on the Society for Psychical Research, which was set up in the 19th century to try and put investigation of the paranormal on a more methodological and scientific footing. And it had members were Arthur Conan Doyle and several prominent scientists. So you had that sort of school, and they try and be methodological. They'd take it in turns and have rotas to stand watch at certain places and communicate by telephone with each other to try and either catch sight of the ghost or prove that it existed. But as well as that, you had on the other side the spiritualists who would use mediums. And so there was always a bit of tension between these two, because the Society for Psychical Research in 1930, there was a mass resignation led by Arthur Conan Doyle, because he thought the society was being too skeptical of mediums, that they were doing too much work debunking fraudulent mediums. In those days, mediums used what we call physical mediumship, where they'd sort of spin ectoplasm out of various orifices and paint these dolls luminous and pretend they'd be that they were a spirit and so on. So they would, a bit like Harry Houdini, rip off the cabinet where the medium was hiding and show the trickery. And so a lot of the spiritualists resigned in protest from the Society for Psychical Research. So you had that tension in some of these investigations. And, you know, when I talked about the clanking ghost of East Barnet, there was a sense that these local investigators, they were here with all their equipment ready to catch the ghost, and they never saw anything. But these spiritualists came up from London, and they'd all say, oh yeah, we saw the ghost, we saw loads of them. And so it would make them really angry that all these people were muscling in on their ghosts. And, you know, to make it even worse, there'd be thousands of drunk people just coming for a bit of a laugh and to scare each other and tell each other's ghost stories. So it was rather tense, but it was also quite comical, really, in the way, you know, I think it would make an interesting film to see how all these people interacted with each other.
Well, yeah, because even what you were talking about, spiritualism and the psychic studies, I probably didn't say the name right, because you got to, like you say, I've lived in North America my whole life. We never had things like that back in the day, even. So that's why I was asking you, because there was a differentiation I could tell from the stories that you're telling, and that blows my mind. Mind you, there is a study that I'm going to get back into, and hopefully we'll do a show in the new year. It'll probably be a Thursday show. But the skull experiments over in the UK, I'm sure you're aware of them, right?
Yeah.
So what's a consensus over there? Just, I know I'm getting a bit off track, but I'm really interested. Like, do they think it's a hoax? Because that was some really unusual, like, I've seen the documentary. It's really intriguing.
Yeah, just if I remember rightly, is this experiment the one where people invented a ghost and then tried to contact him? Is that the one?
No. So it was a bunch of well-known, I think, psychics and mediums and people within the paranormal world. And they were meeting, I forget where it was, and they were getting together and they started getting things like communications from spirits. And I know they did a bunch of experiments, like there was another guy, I think, that developed some type of technology that was almost like a soul phone, they were calling it. Like you could hear someone's voice across the veil, they were saying. And so they would get directions from whom was coming through. And the one experiment that they filmed this all, they made a documentary of it, and they put old time rolls of film, completely sealed. They put it in a box that was completely locked, and the spirit said that were coming through, there wasn't just one, that they would show up on the film. And when you look at it in the documentary, and this is done way before Photoshop, it was done way before AI, there are real faces in there. And there were a few things, I think, from what they were receiving that they could verify. They would say that things would just fall out of nowhere and show up. And again, nobody called it a hoax in the documentary. They basically just showed what it was. I think it went on for 5 years. It's a really fascinating study. And again, I don't know what to believe, because you know, I always say I got a lot of questions. Just because you show me a movie, I got a lot of questions, or documentary.
Interesting. No, I haven't heard of that one. I have to look that one up.
I think it's on YouTube. So Scole is SCOLE. And sorry, I got a cat here. I think it's about an hour and a half or 2 hours long. And you can tell by the quality of the film. It was done, I want to say, late 80s, early 90s. I could be wrong about that, but yeah, it's a really interesting story. Now, I know I've heard from, disbelievers that they think it's a hoax because other people have tried to recreate what happened to these people. And it wasn't just once they met. Like, this was over several times, I want to say a month, and the same people. And it went over a couple years. So it's really interesting that we're talking about hoaxes and things like this, right? And I'm thinking, I thought, with you being over in the UK, if you thought about it, so you'll have to let me know what your thoughts are if you get a chance to watch it.
Yeah, I'll definitely look that one up.
It was really fascinating to watch, but again, I have questions. So Kat wants to know, do you sell autographed copies of your book?
Yes. Well, no, in fact, I'm not sure how I could get an autographed copy. You can always contact me through my website, yes, which is paulweatherhead.com. So yeah, that's always possible.
Mm-hmm. And just so, yes. So you guys know it's scrolling across the bottom too. So I'm glad you called it out there too. And that was a nice question to ask. So we've only got a few more minutes, and I don't want to miss any. Like I say, I always like to ask people, is there something maybe you've taught, because you end up going on a few podcasts. If there's something you want to share with us, like I said, whether it's from the book or whatever that you haven't talked about that you'd like to talk about.
Yeah. I suppose one of the really fascinating things for me is we've touched on it a little bit, but we tend to forget that we share the world with people who occasionally make things up. And we were talking about factitious disorder and how it affects the medical profession. Mm-hmm. People have heard of Munchausen by proxy and so
Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, people have heard of those and then seen the TV movies and some of the horrible events. But when these ghost panics that I talk about happen, it sort of creates this space where people can invent this story and then they can harvest sympathy. So as well as the ghost hoaxes that we had, in these ghost panics, the guy with the sheet over his head, quite often you would also get victim hoaxers who they'd hear about they'd read these stories, and so about a ghost scaring people, and so they would say, a ghost scared me, I was scared out of my wits, and so they'd be hysterical, and what would happen is they'd get mollycoddled, they'd get the day off work, everybody would want to hear their story, they'd be the center of attention. So you get these strange things, this other strange side to the story. I mean, we saw it with when we talked about the Halifax slasher, bringing it full circle right at the beginning, where rumors spread of a maniac attacking people, and then it turned out that all the victims had invented the story. And so yeah, and these things sort of seem to spread by some kind of social contagion, where people see it, read about it, and then copy it. So it's something to always have in the back of your mind, that these people can, that are they ill, or is that one way to look at it? Is it a mental illness? They seem perfectly sane in every other way, and psychiatrists sort of struggle to know how to deal with it. When it involves children, it's black and white. They treat it as a criminal case, but when it doesn't involve children, they struggle to know how to characterize it. And so that's one interesting thing to me, because I've also sort of, going through the archives, I keep an eye out for quite unusual abduction stories, not alien abduction stories, but you notice these strange cases of people saying, oh, I was abducted by these villains, and they took me to a cottage and they tied me up, and and then I escaped, and they tied me up and fed me for a night and 2 nights, but they didn't do anything. And quite a lot of these, when you look at them, they're quite suspicious. And there's a lovely example from not far from where I live, where this rumor spread that there was a cave girl living in this cave in this isolated area by a village in Yorkshire, and the rumor spread around the village, and occasionally this girl would appear in the village, and she told them all, yeah, I was being abused in this house, I had a cruel master, I was a servant, and I had to run away, and now I live in this cave in the woods all alone. And she got this romantic nickname of Florrie All Alone. And and it turned out, that, and she lived there with this mysterious cat that she shared the cave with, and it turned out she'd made the whole story up, and she lived in a nice middle-class family in the next village. But she'd come and sit in the cave and read all these lurid, sensational novels, and then that would fill her imagination with these stories, and she'd go into the village and tell everyone, these dramatic adventure stories that she just made up. So that, I've always been fascinated by the psychology of this, and this kind of process where people among us will sort of invent stories and and give us the riches of their imagination.
I have to agree with you, because there's many psychological issues. Like I know Munchausen syndrome by proxy, they've changed it to another name, relatively new, but that exists. And then it even makes me think of The Sixth Sense, that movie, right? The little girl in there, her stepmom took her life, but she kept making her ill. She was slowly poisoning her. And it fascinates me too, Paul. Like, even when I follow true crime, because I'm trying to figure out what would ever possess somebody to do that. Or, and then you got to feel sorry for people that they make up a story just to get sympathy, or somebody put in the chat, mollycoddled, or you almost want to think, what is missing in your life that if you just put it down on paper even and written a story, you probably would have had a fantastical book, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, everybody's loving that you think we've done a great show here. They're all saying thank you. You're a great guest. I think you are too. Can you tell people what have you got coming up, or where to buy your book? Anything you've got coming up? Like I say, social media, anything? Please go ahead and share with us.
So I blog regularly at paulweatherhead.com, mostly on weird history, mass hysteria, paranormal, that kind of thing. The kind of thing that we all love. So my book, Phantoms of Christmas Past, should be available wherever you get your books from. It's easy to find online. At the moment, I'm working on the next book, which is about demonic possession.
I gotta have to have you back on, because I had a demon in my house. Yeah, he came to me in a dream. It happened 17 years ago, and people argue with me. I am telling you, told me his name, told me how to spell it, told me his animal form. I can describe it like it happened 3 minutes ago. This was over 17 years ago. All hell broke loose in my house, and I looked everywhere for this name. I'd never heard it before, and I'm a retired Catholic, I call myself, and I'd never heard this, and I was helping somebody 5 years later. They had gotten some name in a dream. I said, well, this isn't my field of expertise. I prefer to work in the light than the dark. And I looked it up, and I just about fell off my chair, because the name I had been given, I'm getting goosebumps as I'm telling you, the spelling, the animal form, all of it right there on paper in front of me. So how did I get all that?
Wow.
Mm-hmm. So demonic possession, I hope, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I'm dying to hear about this book too.
It was very common it's really in the 1600s. So it was a religious battleground, with the Catholics and the Puritans both using demonic possession and exorcism as a weapon to try and win converts. And then you got the conservative Church of England in the middle trying to dampen it down and put a stop to it. So you have all these strange sort of religious theological battles going on between different communities, and you had all these kinds of strange behavior, and people speaking languages they didn't know, and sort of bending their backwards, being unable to stop dancing, and all kinds of crazy stories going on. So I think people have heard of the Lancashire witches, the witch trials of 1612. We had our own here in 1612, and the Lancashire witches was a famous one. And this sort of the demonic possession stories happened in the same century, parallel to these, but it's a story that hasn't really been told before. So, it's one of the things about research is finding a story that hasn't been told before and diving into it.
Well, everybody's saying very interesting. So I won't put you on the spot, but when it comes out, I would love to have you on to talk about that, because that, again, to hear it from that perspective, like you said, the story that hasn't been told, how fascinating. So I want to thank you for coming on here. You guys, remember, you can get a hold of Paul at paulweatherhead.com, or you can buy his books anywhere where they're sold. Guys, we are still looking for stories. It does not have to be a haunted holiday story on Christmas night. Carrie Lynn and I are still doing a show. We would like to have you come on. You don't have to. You can reach either one of us on social media to share your story, but it doesn't have to be spooky. Maybe it's a Christmas miracle or something really touching that has come across, and you guys, during the season, you want to share with us. You can, like I said, reach out to either one of us on social media, or Carrie Lynn's, so KERRILYNNS porch at gmail.com. And we'll be there at about 7:10 p.m. Christmas night. Also, stay tuned. Coming up is Preston Dennett and Dolly Saffron. with the Light Gate. I want to thank Carnation for sponsoring us for all of us here on Mondays. And I thank Paul once again for coming on. Thank you for spending your time. I know it's late over there.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
And if you guys ever want to get a hold of me, you can get a hold of me on any social media platform. My business page at the moment is facebook.com/The Angel Rock. I do psychic, I do mediumship readings, I do crystal Reiki, energy healing, and I do teaching and mentoring. So feel free to reach out. And I hope everybody has a wonderful, safe, blessed holiday, whatever you celebrate. And please come hang out with us on Thursday night, everyone. Have a good one, okay?